Hello, welcome to Sensory Nervous System 3. Make sure my pen works. So these are the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So just as a review, there are three functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So there's motor areas, sensory areas, and multimodal association areas. And in this cartoon, it shows in the functional sensory areas, we have the primary sensory cortex, and that lives in the postcentral gyrus. And then we have the sensory association cortex. On the previous video, we looked at the primary motor areas over here, the primary motor areas of the cortex, and they can control voluntary movement. And in this video, we're going to look at the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex, where you get conscious awareness of sensation. And then the association areas, they'll integrate all sorts of information from the motor and sensory cortices. So remember, there were four generalizations about these functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So the first generalization is you can find three kinds of functional areas: motor, sensory, and association cortices. Each cerebral hemisphere and its functional area are concerned with the contralateral or opposite side of the body. So remember, contralateral is opposite. And then there's lateralization of functional areas. That means that there's division of labor between the hemisphere. So your language is usually in the left hemisphere. And then the fourth generalization about all of these functional areas is that no functional areas act alone, so they're all integrated. So here's our cartoon. So this is a lateral view of the left cerebral hemisphere. And then in this cartoon, I haven't shown this yet, but it's the pathway. So a sensory neuron pathway going from the periphery up to your brain. So at each level, there's a cross-section of your spinal cord here. Here's a cross-section of your spinal cord. Well, actually, this is a cross-section. The second one is a cross-section of the medulla oblongata. This is a cross-section of the midbrain. And then this would be a frontal, up here would be a frontal section of the brain. So then we come down here in the lower left-hand corner. It says there's receptors for fine touch, proprioception, and vibration. So let's say you're touching a feather or you're feeling something that's vibrating. That information about that sensation will travel along a sensory afferent neuron here. Here's the cell body of a sensory afferent neuron. So this would be part of the axon of the sensory afferent neuron. So that axon would go in, and then it would, and this is the first neuron coming in. And remember, you're trying to get information about fine touch, the touch of the feather or the vibration. You're trying to get that information up to the brain. So the first neuron would travel into the spinal cord, and then it would move up here, and it would synapse with a second order neuron here in the nuclei or collections of cell bodies in the medulla oblongata, and then that second order neuron would move up here through the midbrain, and then the second order neuron would synapse with a third order sensory neuron in the thalamus, and then that third order sensory neuron would take that information up to the primary sensory area of the cerebral cortex, and you would feel the feather, the fine touch, or the vibration. So that's kind of the big picture. But this primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex gets sensory information, specifically sensory information from the skin, skeletal muscles, and joints. So this is a somatic, part of the somatic motor nervous system. So anytime you see skin, skeletal muscle, and joints, then you're dealing with the somatic nervous system. So the primary somatosensory cortex is located in the postcentral gyrus. So remember, here's the central sulcus right here, this line, and then this is the postcentral gyrus, this blue thing, and that's where the primary somatosensory cortex is located. And this I stuck in this cartoon right here because it's a cartoon of a sensory neuron. So here's the cell body of the sensory neuron. And remember, it's unipolar because it's got only one pole coming off of its cell body. But then it has a central axon and it has a peripheral axon. And then these are the receptive endings out here. So they would be, for example, in the cartoon I just talked about, these receptive endings would be sensitive to fine touch or vibration. And then they would send that information in the form, so you'd start out as a local potential here, and then that information would travel along the axon as an action potential via the peripheral process of the axon, and then it would travel along the central process of the axon to get into the spinal cord. So there's 8 functional sensory areas of the cerebral cortex, and the first functional area, number 1, is the primary somatosensory cortex, and that lives here in the precentral gyrus. Or, I'm sorry, I'm glad I have the notes. Not the precentral, but the postcentral gyrus. And this area, this primary sensory area or primary somatosensory cortex, is capable of spatial discrimination. So when a certain region of your body is being stimulated, so for example, your fingertips, if you touch a feather, the primary somatosensory cortex would be able to distinguish that. And we saw this motor homunculus in the previous video. Now you have a sensory homunculus. So all these areas of the cerebral cortex in blue correspond with an area of your body. So as you know, you're very sensitive. So there's a lot of sensory neurons in your face, your nose, your lips, in your fingertips. So the relatively you have a lot of sensory neurons in your fingers and face, basically, relative to the other parts of your body. So the second sensory area of the cerebral cortex is the somatosensory association cortex. So that's this blue back here. It's posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. It integrates input from the primary somatosensory cortex. So the primary somatosensory cortex will get information, and then it will send it to the somatosensory association cortex, where the information about what you're touching or feeling will get integrated. So somatosensory association cortex can determine an object's size, its texture, the relationship of the parts in the object. So the third functional area of the cerebral cortex is the visual sensory area. So this is, let's get our bearings. So here's the cerebellum. Here's the occipital lobe of the brain. So then we'd have the parietal and the temporal lobes here. But in this cartoon, it shows that the very rear of your brain in the occipital lobe is your primary visual cortex. So this, and then just anterior to that, you have a visual association cortex. So the primary visual association cortex will receive information from the retina, and then the visual association cortex here will integrate that information. And you use, as you probably know, you use past visual experiences to interpret visual stimuli. For example, the color, the form, and movement of an object will be integrated with past visual information that you've stored. The fourth sensory area of the cerebral cortex is the auditory sensory area. So auditory, that has to do with hearing. So remember, in this cartoon, it shows the Broca's area. Remember, that was from the last video, motor integration to produce speech. Well, now, Wernicke's area is also on the left, or the left hemisphere. Wernicke's area integrates information so that you can comprehend speech. So one area allows you to produce speech, that's Broca's area. The other area allows you to comprehend what a person is saying or your dog is saying. So the primary auditory cortex is located here in the temporal lobe, and it receives action potentials from the inner ear, and that makes sense because you hear through your ear, and it can interpret pitch, loudness, and location. And we'll talk about pitch, loudness, and location of sound when we do the special senses and when we do the ear. And then the auditory association cortex here, it further will interpret the sound. So you'll, in the primary auditory cortex, you'll hear a pitch and how loud the sound is. But in the auditory association cortex or area, you're going to interpret the sound. Was it talking? Was it music? And then you can also store sound memories there for future reference. So that's kind of cool. And then it's just a little bit more information about Wernicke's area, where the area that you use to comprehend what people are saying. So comprehend or understand what the words are saying. These language centers, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, in 90% of the people it's in the left hemisphere, but some of the people, 10% of the people, Broca and Wernicke's area are in the right hemisphere. And then in this area, so if this is the left side for Wernicke's and Broca's area, it's the left side. On the right side, you have areas that are not Broca's or Wernicke's areas, but you still have corresponding excuse me, areas on the right side that are involved with nonverbal language. So the speaker's tone, how the speaker appears to you. Okay, and we talked about Broca's area is involved in speaking language. Okay, so the next sensory areas of the cerebral cortex, number 5. So we're at the olfactory sensory cortex, which is right here, this yellow patch. You get action potentials from olfactory nerves, so that has to do with your sense of smell. So that's located in your nasal cavity. This gives you, the olfactory cortex allows you to have a conscious awareness of an odor, which can be nasty sometimes. You find the olfactory cortex in the temporal lobe. And then number 6, the 6th of the 8 sensory areas of the cerebral cortex is the gustatory or taste cortex. So it's located right here. Receives action potentials from your taste buds. And we'll look at the biochemistry of taste buds and sending action potentials when we do the special senses. And then this is just kind of interesting. During the course of evolution, most of the old rhinencephalon, which is now our olfactory cortex, but it used to be called the rhinencephalon, it's taken, so it's our olfactory cortex now, and it's involved with olfaction and detecting smells, but it's also part of our emotions and memory. And that, I like this because that makes sense. Obviously, everyone's had the experience where you smell something and it evokes a strong memory. The 7th of the 8 sensory areas of the cerebral cortex include the vestibular cortex, so that's located right here. You get action potentials from your internal organs. Wait, did I say? Oops, where is the cartoon of the visceral sensory area? Oh, it's not shown here. Sorry. Yeah, let's do the visceral sensory area. So anytime you see the word viscera, you are thinking about your internal organs, like your guts, so your stomach and your intestines. When your stomach is full, for example, or your bladder is full, that information will allow you to have conscious perception of that visceral stimulation. And then you remember in a few videos ago, when we pull back the temporal and the frontal lobes and you go deep in here, you can find the insula, and that's where the visceral sensory area is located. And then the eighth of the 8 sensory areas of the cerebral cortex is the vestibular or equilibrium cortex. So, and that's located right here. So you get action potentials from the inner ear, your eyes, your head, your neck, and it allows you to have conscious awareness of your balance. And that's all 8 of the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. And then there are a couple other slides that I'm going to go over that I put in at the end. So functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So we had the motor areas, the sensory areas, and now we've got the multimodal association area or cortex, and it has 3 parts. So this is, your eyes would be up here. So the 3 parts of the multimodal association cortex would be the anterior association cortex, the limbic association cortex, and the posterior association cortex. So this multimodal association cortex is where sensations, thoughts, and emotions are. The multimodal association cortex basically makes us who we are. So when we're understanding the world, when we try to understand what we see and what we hear, we're using the the multimodal association cortex. And it has 3 parts, and I just showed you down here in the cartoon. So this shows a cartoon of the prefrontal cortex and all the tasks that are undertaken in this cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, or AKA the anterior association cortex, which is part of the multimodal association cortex. So this is where you do working memory for spatial tasks. It's the executive area to manage all your tasks. It's complex problem solving, working memory for object recall tasks. So there's this multimodal association area gets input from multiple senses. So for example, your sense of vision, hearing, smell, and basically the prefrontal cortex is involved with your intellect and your ability to learn complex things, your ability to judge, reason, have a conscience. That's all in the prefrontal cortex. It's slow to develop in children, so you probably heard this. This doesn't fully wire up till, for some people, 25 years old. And how this wires up, how this develops, depends on feedback from the social environment. That gets pretty complicated. And this is a cartoon that just shows all of the areas together in one cartoon. This is another cartoon that shows all the areas that we talked about, the sensory areas and the motor areas together. This would be a sagittal section through the brain to show you all the parts that we've talked about and that we haven't talked about. So for example, we didn't talk about this corpus callosum that links the right and left hemispheres together through tracts. We'll talk about that in another lecture. But we did talk about the visual association area, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the central sulcus. So a lot of these we have talked about. So you can look at that as a sagittal section of the brain. So this is a cartoon of the hippocampus, this blue structure. Actually is this part too. And the hippocampus is involved in memory. And here's just a flow chart. If you've taken psychology, you've probably seen a bunch of these flow charts, but basically you have 2 major types of memory, declarative and non-declarative. So declarative memory is like a declarative sentence. So declarative memory contains information about facts and events. Non-declarative memory is a memory about our basic skills, like our motor skills and how we move. And then lateralization, we mentioned this lateralization of cortical function. So there's a division of labor between the hemispheres. Remember, we looked at Broca's area and Wernicke's area are on the left side of the brain. That's language is on the left side of the brain. And so there's a concept called cerebral dominance. 90% of people are left hemisphere dominant for language, math, and logic. So that's, I think, people have heard of either your left or right brain, but that's really not accurate to think of it that way. 90% of the people are left hemisphere dominant for math and logic, not that if you're left brain, you are really good at math and logic. That's not the way to think about it. The right hemisphere in everyone is, or 90% of the people anyway, is more involved with intuition, emotion, arts, and music. So everybody has a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. It's not really accurate to think of people being right and left brain, but there's continuous integrated communication between the two hemispheres through that structure I showed in the previous slide, called the corpus callosum. So this is kind of a cool cartoon. It just shows in the left hemisphere where we have rational symbolic thought. Over here in the right hemisphere, we have musical ability, intuitive, nonverbal thought. So you can look through that. And then the next slide is our limbic system. That's our emotional brain. Here's a cartoon of the limbic system. You need to know the structures of the limbic system include the cingulate gyrus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the parahippocampal gyrus. Those are all the structures in the limbic system. So the limbic system is the third of the three parts of the multimodal association cortex. And this is an interesting cartoon, how amygdala hijacking happens. So this is a cartoon. So the amygdala is kind of in this area here. Stimuli goes into the thalamus, and then it goes right. So let's say, let me back up. A frightening stimulus goes directly to the thalamus, and then goes right into the amygdala before it goes up here to the neocortex, where you can process it rationally. So before you can even process a fearful thing rationally, it's in your amygdala making you scared. But then the information goes up to the neocortex, and you can, if it's not actually a fearful situation, you can understand that. But it's a survival mechanism. And this is kind of funny, the limbic system, between liberals and conservatives. Let's see. Liberals are associated with openness to new experiences. Conservatives are associated with conscientiousness. Conservatives have a heightened sensitivity to threatening and disgusting images. So for example, if you showed maybe a mild threatening image, it's more probable that a conservative would be scared by that image than a liberal would be. Liberals tend to have stronger connectivity in the mirror neuron system that allows you to have empathy. And that's not to say that both liberals and conservatives don't, both liberals and conservatives do have empathy. Both liberals and conservatives are conscientious. Both liberals and conservatives can be scared by a threatening image. It's just the neuroscience shows that there's a higher probability in the liberal or the conservative to react one way or the other depending on what they see. And then I think this is the last one. This is a reticular formation, controls the state of alertness in the cerebral cortex. So the reticular formation, you can see, is kind of throughout the whole brain. So if you are alert, you can thank your reticular formation for sending action potentials and information to the whole brain to stay alert.